Miami, Florida. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I started my career as a high school math teacher, and after I taught, I started teaching actually in Atlanta, Georgia. And after that, I went overseas for a few years, worked there. And while I was overseas, I was part of an interesting study collaboration between Oxford and Cambridge. And I'd like to replicate that study with you. We did it earlier and we got some good results, so I'm going to try it again with you folks, see what kind of results we get this time around. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just put your hands together just like this, or side by side, I should say. And I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and on the count of 3, I just want you to put your hands together. You guys ready? 1, 2, 3. All right. So after 5 years of intensive research, this is what they found. They said that if your right thumb is over your left thumb, you're amongst the most beautiful people on earth. Okay? But they said if your left thumb is over your right thumb, you're amongst the smartest people on earth. All right. So just by a show of hands, where are my beautiful people at? All right. And where are my smart people at? All right. So if I can take all the beautiful people, if you can move over to this side of the... I'm kidding. So I want to tell you another story, and this involves my brother. And my brother is an interesting character. And not long ago, I was home visiting my parents, and he happened to be home as well. And his name is Brian, and we were at the dinner table, and he was on his phone. And so I looked at him and I said, Brian, put your phone away. And so he looked at me, he looked at his phone, and he kept texting. So I waited. Then I said, my big brother voice, Brian, put your phone away. And so he stops, he looks at me, looks at his phone, and keeps texting. And right before I was about to hit him upside the head, my mama intervened. And my mom said, it's okay, don't worry about it. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're announcing a special session. I can do today over there, creating online lessons using PowerPoint and Office 6 at 2 to 2:45 and 3 to 3:45 in room D5. Do not want any guys to sign up. First come, first served.
All right. This reminds me, have you ever gone through those moments where you're teaching a lesson and it's really, really good and it's going really well, and then the fire alarm comes on and then you just lose them all? Right, so my mom intervenes and she says, don't worry about it, because he has the FOMO. Right? And I looked at her and I said, the FOMO? And then my brother stopped and he looked at her and said, the FOMO? And I was intrigued by this. And she said, yeah, the FOMO. And I was intrigued by the fact that my mom even knew this term, but the FOMO, I looked it up, and it stands for the fear of missing out. And a lot of our generation, a lot of students in this generation, I should say, suffer from this FOMO. So I did some research, and I come to find out that there's a wonderful researcher out of MIT. His name is Cheryl Turkle, and she's actually written a book about this phenomenon. It's called Alone Together. And in it, she describes why we get so attached to our devices, right, to our technologies. And she says there's 3 main reasons, right? The first reason is that the technology allows us to put our attention wherever we want it, right? That's why social media is so prevalent in kids' lives today, in many people's lives, I should say. The second big idea, of course, is that the technology always allows us to be heard, right? This is why people love to do their status updates. Have you seen that, right? Especially kids, they love to update their statuses. But the third one was the most compelling to me, and that's the fact that you never have to be alone. You never feel alone, right? Because you're always sharing your experiences with others in the hopes that others are either going to like what they see or read, right? Or interact with you in some type of way. So when we think about these big trends, we see this in the world around us, right? How many of you have encountered this, or these scenarios, right? Where you see people walking down the street and all they're doing is looking at their phone, right? Not minding anything else but just their phone. Or you may be out at dinner where you see families in different tables, or maybe couples, who instead of talking to one another and interacting, they're just simply on their phones. Have you seen that phenomenon? And so when you hear a lot of people talk to you about, what is our 21st century all about, they often say that, we're going to be defined, or this century will be defined by the fact that we're all connected, which is true. But the irony, of course, is that in our quest to become connected, we may be becoming more disconnected in some ways. But really, I don't think it's about being connected. I think it's about this concept of what we term as connectedness, which is the capacity to use the fact that we're connected for different types of reasons, whether they be educational, social, or other. And so when you think about teaching and learning and how technology can impact, I'm going to use the analogy of crossing the street. So if you think about the process of crossing the street, there's actually 4 steps that we go through. The first step, of course, is when we're carried across, right? Our parents carry us across the street because we're yet not able to do that on our own. We don't know the rules, we don't have the capability to do that. But then when we get a little older, we're able to walk, across the street, but usually holding someone's hand, holding mom and dad's hand, right? Taken by the hand. We have someone that's helping us along. And as we're doing this, we're learning, the rules about crossing the street. The next step, of course, is we're accompanied. Well, we don't have to hold someone's hand, but they just need to be there, like that wiser other to have there, right? And then, of course, the final step is when we have the freedom to transit on our own, where we don't need someone else to help us. We can do this on our own because we know, right, the rules. We know to look both ways. We know to take our time, etc. And it seems like as we look across education globally, it seems to follow a certain trend. And that's that when we talk about this concept of being carried across, we always typically seem to do that in K-12 education. And I don't know why it is that it literally takes someone getting their PhD to come to this concept of being able to freedom, right? To have this transit, the freedom of transit. And why does that happen? Why can't we have all of this right from the beginning? And so when we look at technology, there's 3 kind of camps that we can fall into, right? Folks we call our evangelists, which are folks that say that technology is going to be largely influential, specifically in education, and that it's going to transform education in many, many different ways. And they have all these grand ideas as to how it's going to do that. But then we have folks on the other side of the spectrum, which we call our catastrophists. And these are folks that believe that technology will have a huge impact on education, but it's going to be largely negative, right? That technology is going to have this form of edutainment instead of focusing on matters of the curriculum. And then we have this third group. And if you're not already in this third group, I'd like to encourage you to be in this third group. And these are folks that we call our skeptics. And when you think of skeptics, typically you think as a negative connotation, right? But I'd like to propose that, for me, skeptic has 3 qualities. Someone who's curious, someone who takes that curiosity and explores, right? Does some exploration, and then takes that exploration and evaluates whether or not the curiosity is right or wrong. And it's these folks, right, who believe that technology will have some impact but don't know how or why, and are constantly investigating these, right, that we need to fall into because it allows us to do different types of things. And it changes our mindset into how we view technology. So economists have known this for many, many years. And so I'd like to share with you some of their ideas. But before I do that, I actually want to get some feedback from you. So I have a question for all of you. If you have your cell phone or your device, you can join in. You can text the code 37607. And you're going to text somewhere along this Likert scale. So each of those you see has a keyword, a number keyword. And the question is this: in your opinion, right, where do you fall on this scale? Teaching is getting easier. Do you strongly agree with this statement? Do you strongly disagree with this statement, or somewhere in between? So let me go ahead and start this for you folks. Okay? And hopefully we'll be able to get some feedback from you in terms of what you think. Wow. We're all over. This is good. So it seems like, by and large, we're maybe trending a little bit toward the disagree. Tend to disagree with the statement. Okay? Okay. So, that's very good. So I'm gonna keep that in mind. I'm gonna ask you a second question. Okay, you're gonna use the same scale. Instead, this time, I'd like for you to answer this. Learning is getting easier. What do you think? Do you strongly agree with that statement? Do you strongly disagree with the statement, or somewhere in between? Learning is getting easier. What do you think? All right. apologize, I only have a certain number that go through. But the point here is that, so because of time, I'm not going to be able to do this, but typically I would give you time to kind of talk with your colleagues about why you believe or why you have the opinions, right? And then share some of those out. So I've done this all over the world. I did this earlier as well. And I want to show you the results. So when I asked the question, teaching is getting easier, by and large, it follows the same trend. And it's usually this one, where most often people disagree with the statement, right? People often tend to disagree with the statement. Now, the folks I asked range from teachers to parents to students to ministers of education to heads of state. But they always follow the same patterns. And when I ask them, learning is getting easier, they tend to agree with the statement. So the question is why? Why is there this difference, right? And when you ask them that, there's certainly a lot of opinions about why this happens. But one of the ones that always comes up to the forefront is this concept that technology has a lot to do with this, right? Because technology can certainly make teaching easier, but it can also create barriers for teachers that maybe aren't as fluent in using that technology. And it can also make learning easier, right? Because students have better access to information, but just having better access to the information doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning anything. So these are really tough questions to answer. And so going back to economists, they have thought about these for a long time. And this has spurred a lot of research in this area. So I'd like to take you for a little journey about the research and where we've been in thinking about this concept of school and effectiveness. So the first round, right, if you break this into rounds, the first round of research looked at characteristics of schools. Because what they wanted to know was, well, if I have two schools and one's better than the other, what makes this school better than that one? And if I can find out what those things are, then I can implement those in the other school and it can be better. Make sense? So after years and years of research, they came up with three things. So I'm going to share with you the three things that you need to do if you want your school to be highly effective. Are you all ready? All right. The first thing that you need to do is you need to get rid of the boys. Okay? That's number one. Get rid of the boys. Right. Now, why is that? Well, because all over the world, right, data suggests that women or girls tend to outperform boys on most all metrics, specifically in male-dominated subjects like math and science. So if you want to have an effective school, get rid of the boys. That's number one. Number two, the second thing you have to do is you have to become a parochial school. Okay? You have to become a parochial school. Why? Well, because again, all over the world, parochial schools tend to outperform public and other private institutions. Now, there's certainly a caveat to that, right? Because parochial schools select the students that they let into their schools. So that's the second big idea. The third big idea, if you want to have a highly effective school, is you need to move into a nice, leafy suburban area, right? Because that gives you two immediate benefits. One, you'll have a better student, and two, you'll have parents who are better able to provide resources for those students so that they can extend that learning outside of the school time. Now, you may be thinking, well, this is silly, which is the same thing the researchers were thinking. So they said, well, maybe it's not the differences in school, right? Maybe it's the differences in students. So the second round of research actually looked at differences in student characteristics. What makes one student better than the other? And this is what they found. They said, if I take two schools and I look at student achievement, right, the variability between schools happens to only be 26%, right? And variability within a school is actually 74%. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, in practical terms, it means this, that it doesn't much matter which school you go to, but it matters very, very much what classes you're in within that same school. And that's led us into the third round of research, which is where we're in now, which are looking at what we call value-added factors. And in layman's terms, value-added just simply means the difference between what a student knows before he went into that school and what he knows after he graduated from that school. And so we're looking at different metrics. And so one particular study that's often cited to prove this point is a study that was done in the state of Tennessee. And this was a while back, actually. This was back in 1996. But this data set was really peculiar because the researchers had access to over 3 million records. And what they could do is they could map the student to the teachers that taught those students to the classes that they were in. And so what they did, or what they found, was this. If you looked at a student, say in grade 2, and you looked at the span of 3 years, and that particular student was at the 50th percentile of achievement, If they were taught with what they termed as a low-performing teacher, after 3 years, they would actually end up at the 7th percentile. But if that same student was taught over the course of those 3 years with what they termed as a highly effective teacher, then that student after 3 years would end up at the 90th percentile, right? A 53-point percentile difference. Now, more recent studies have been able to replicate these same results. So what does all that mean? Well, something that we've all known for a long, long time, right? The teachers are the #1 factor in determining the success of students. So, knowing this, how does technology then play a role in all of this? Right? So I want to show you or share with you a couple of ideas as to how we can do this and what we view in terms of technology. So first, I want to say that over the last 10 years, we've had and developed technologies that have allowed us to look into the human brain, right? And this neuroscience kind of stuff, right? And there's this new kind of wave in education called neuroeducation, which merges what we know in the cognitive sciences with what we're learning in terms of physiologically what's going on, right? So as you're doing different cognitive tasks, or as you're doing different physical tasks, what's going on in the brain? And so, because of that, we've also come across some myths. So I'm going to share some of these with you. You may have seen these before. Here are just some, right? Just a few. How many of you have heard of or heard these before? Anybody? Yeah. How many of you have heard that you should play classical music to young kids because it makes them smarter? Yeah. I was actually telling the other group that on my way here, I saw a movie on the plane called Lucy. Have you guys heard of that movie? And the premise of this movie is that this young lady gets these powers that allows her to use more than 10% of her brain. And she can, do all sorts of cool things. Well, I can tell you that if you really think about it, that you only use 10% of your brain, that doesn't make much sense, does it? We actually use all of our brain. So anyone that tells you that if you hear, hey, Einstein used 14% of his brain, so he's smarter than us, right? It's not true. But I'll tell you an interesting story about this concept of I'm left brain and you're right brain, and we're different. My second year teaching, I had a young lady who was failing my class. And she was failing my class after just one quiz that she took because it was the second week of school. And so her mom called the parent conference meeting. So I went into the conference and I had the principal, the assistant principal, the counselor, myself, the young lady, mom, dad, and the psychologist. And so we're all sitting there and mom was telling me, my daughter is really not learning in your class. Well, ma'am, it's only been 2 weeks. No, she's not learning in your class. She's really frustrated. She comes home and she's just hugely frustrated because you're a very right-brain teacher. And my daughter only learns through left brain, whatever. The psychologist says so, right? Well, there is no such thing, right? There is no such thing as right and left brain. We use both parts of our brain, all right? Now, what do we know about this? Well, there's a lot of cool things that we know about this, and later on, if you get a chance to visit with Dr. Gupta, who is running a session on Office Mix, he expands on this a little bit. But I want to give you just a glimpse of some of the things that we've learned. And I want to touch on the concept of visual perception, because that's something that quite interests me. So we're not very good at seeing the world around us. As a matter of fact, you don't see very much of the world around you. Okay? Humans have something that's called change blindness, where something happens in front of you, but if you're not completely focused on that thing, it'll run right by you. Okay? So in our eyes, we have some limitations, right? In the back of your eye, you have your retina, and inside your retina, you have an area, a small area called the fovea. And inside the fovea, you have two main types of receptor cells. One's called cones, and one's called rods. The cones, you have three types. You have red, green, and blue. They allow you to see color, or the perception of color as light bounces off objects. You also have rods, which allow you to see in maybe low light situations, right? So those are kind of layman summaries of what those mean. So what does that mean then? Well, it means that our eyes sometimes play tricks on us, right? Because our brain is forever trying to fill in the gaps of what we're actually seeing. That's how optical illusions are made. So I want to show you this image here, and I want to ask you, where do you think we are? What would you say? Jungle, okay. Someone once told me is their backyard, which I thought was pretty interesting. So this is an example of what you would see, right, if you walked out and there was no sunlight. So you may have encountered this. Maybe you wake up in the middle of the night, right, and you open your eyes and your eyes kind of get adjusted to the things around you. But if I were to ask you, hey, what's the color of that object on top of your dresser, you wouldn't be able to tell me, right? But you could see kind of the shape and so on and so forth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add sunlight to this image. And I want to see if your perception of this image changes. So when I add sunlight, does your perception change? Well, the hope is that it does, because if not, we're going to get eaten by that little panther that's on the bottom right, okay? So you see, just by adding sunlight, all of a sudden things change, right? And so when we think about this, we need to be cognizant of the fact that the way that we perceive digital media is a lot different than the way we perceive analog media. Difference between seeing things on the screen versus, say, on paper. Let me give you another example. Look at this image here. Who do you see? Everybody see Abraham Lincoln? Okay, very good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this image. Do you see Abraham Lincoln? Or a distorted version of Abraham Lincoln, right? Now this is quite interesting. I'm going to show you another image to kind of make this point more explicit. Who do you see here? Okay, so I'm going to rotate this image and you tell me if you see anything different. Yeah. See the difference? Now this is a peculiarity about human beings, that we can only recognize faces when they're right side up. If they're upside down, right, our associations and our experience take over and fill in the gaps of what our eyes actually see. If I were to rotate this image again, those differences would be harder to see, right? So again, a peculiarity. I'm going to show you one other image. And this is one out of MIT. It's one of my favorites. So here I have a checkerboard with different colored grays. I have two labeled A and B. My question to you is, which one do you think is darker? How many of you, by show of hands, think A is darker than B? Raise your hand. How many of you think B is darker than A? How many of you think this is a trick? All right, so what I'm going to do, my friends, is I'm going to pull out a swatch. This is A, this is the dark A, and I'm just going to move that from A to B. And tell me what happens. What do you notice? It's exactly the same color. Why does that happen? And so as we're learning more and more about how we view things and how we perceive things, right, it's giving us some insight into how we interpret these things in our brains. And so that's one of the big ideas. Here's another big idea. So we have the neuro stuff. My younger brother, who you met earlier, Brian, was taking a calculus class. And he calls me up one day and he says, hey, I need some help. Can you tutor me while I take this class? And I hadn't done calculus in a few years. And so I said, yeah, sure, no problem, because this will give me an opportunity to kind of relearn all that stuff. So here's a problem that his professor gave him. And I had forgotten how to do this. Do I have any math teachers in the room? Yeah, a few? All right, so I said, hey, no problem, I'm going to go and relearn this stuff. So would you believe it took me about 2.5 hours to figure this problem out, okay? But I figured it out, and I was really happy, and I was really excited. And I called him back, and I said, hey, get on Skype, because I'm going to teach you how to do this problem. And you know what he said to me? He said, oh, don't worry about it. I got the answer. I'm like, you got the answer? He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, how long did it take you? He said, 5 minutes. And I said, well, I want you to get online anyway because I want you to teach this new method that your professor has obviously taught you, right? And he said, okay. So we got online, and he said, well, what I did was this. My professor gave me that, problem with that pretty picture, and I went to this cool website called Yahoo Answers, and I typed in my question. And you'll notice that the question is word for word the same question that his professor gave him with an image attached. And some guy, about 2 years ago, answered it for him. Okay, and there it is. And so he said, yeah, I just put the answer in, I got it right. So of course, as a teacher, your next question is, well, that's all fine and good, but how are you going to do that on the test? To which his response made me think. His response was, well, that's simple, because it's always the same thing. The only thing that changes are the numbers. So you memorize the steps. Right? And so when we think about this concept of, for example, giving homework, it's not enough to simply say to students, hey, we're all going to do page 39, 2 through 20 even, because the odd ones are in the back of the book, right? Because it's really easy, right, to find the answers. So it is true that information is everywhere, but that's not what's important. What's important is that the answers are there too. So we have to rethink the way that we use this concept of the fact that information is easily accessible. So I'd like to propose 4 ideas for your consideration. The first is this. When you're thinking about technology, I want you to ask 2 questions. All right? Ask yourself 2 questions. The first of which is, does that tool, whatever tool you're going to use, allow you to do something that you couldn't do before? If your answer is yes to that, always ask yourself the second question, and that's this. Does that tool allow you to do something you could do before, but in better ways? And it's only when the answer to these 2 questions is yes, that technology will have an impact on learning. So let me show you an example of a particular tool that I think can answer one of these questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this. I have a video just in case. I actually want to do this live with y'all. So let me see if I can go back. And I'm going to call a friend of mine. We have a tool here that you may or may not be familiar with. How many of you use Skype? Okay, so we have a new functionality to Skype called Skype Translator, which allows you to communicate with people in different languages, real time. So it'll translate your conversation real time, okay? So you can talk to people from all over the world using this technology. So I'm going to call my friend Diego. Diego lives in Colombia, and he's learning English. So I'm helping him learn English, and he's helping me refine my Spanish. So hopefully we'll be able to connect with him. There he is, good. So let's call him. And if we can put the audio up, that would be great. Yeah, he's taking the dog for a walk. All right, so he says he's online. So I'm going to ask my colleague if you can contact him, and maybe he can call us back. In the meantime, however, I've come prepared. Let me show you an example of... Oh, we got him? Okay, one more time. Oh, there he is. Is the audio up? Okay. Diego, ¿cómo estás? Oh, we lost him. That's all right, my friends. Don't worry about it. I have a backup. All right. So let me show you an example then of how this technology is being used in the classroom. To give you some ideas as to how you can use this with your own students in the classroom. Skype is free for everyone, and you can. We're in public beta right now, which means that all of you can join in and try it out and see if it's something that may be useful for you.
¿Te encuentras en América del Norte?
Yes. Do you live in central Mexico?
Sí. ¿Te encuentras en Estados Unidos de América?
Yes. Do you live in a capital city?
Sí. ¿Estás cerca de Seattle?
We are very close to Seattle. Are you in Mexico City?
Sí. ¿Estás en Tacoma?
Yes. Very good guess.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Do you like living in Mexico City?
¿Te gusta vivir en la Ciudad de México?
Aquí está muy lindo.
Here is very nice.
What do you do for fun?
¿Qué haces para divertirte?
Voy a las playas de México.
I'm going to the beaches of Mexico.
I like to swim.
Me gusta nadar.
A mí también.
Me too.
Where in the world do you wish to travel?
¿A dónde en el mundo te gustaría viajar?
A Rusia.
To Russia.
¿Tú?
And you?
Everywhere.
Sería increíble algún día verte en México.
It would be amazing to see you someday in Mexico.
I would really like to visit you sometime.
Me gustaría mucho visitarte algún día.
A mí también.
Me too.
So here's an example of a tool that answered that question: does the tool allow me to do something that I couldn't do before and in better ways, right? We actually have schools in South America that are now signing up to pen pal, basically, with schools in America to learn English. And so what we're finding is that kids do this as a class, but then they exchange their name handles, and they actually become pen pals, friends. You know, when they go home, they call each other and kind of extend that learning over time. So that's one big idea. Here's the second big idea, that this concept of interactivity and engagement should exist at multiple levels. I have no doubt that you have often heard people talk to you about this concept of interaction, right? This tool is really, really interactive, and it makes kids really engaged. Have you heard that before? The problem with that, of course, is that nobody ever bothers to explain to you or define to you, what do you mean by interaction? What do you mean by engagement, right? So when you think about interactivity, I'd like to propose to you to think about three things. The first of which is what we call surface level interaction. And what that means is simply using a tool whereby the student just simply clicks on something and something else happens, right? So they click on the right answer. If they get it right, it tells them, hey, you got it right, move on to the next. Or if you got it wrong, hey, try it again, right? Or maybe a teacher who's using an interactive whiteboard and they're just moving things on the board, right? They're clicking on things and things happen. Those are what we call surface level interactions. There's nothing wrong with those levels of interaction, but they can't be the only types. There's also two others. There's one we call the cognitive level of interaction, which is how does the student, or the learner in this case, interact with the content at a cognitive level, right? Building these learning schemas, or these cognitive keys that we call. And then also this concept of socio-cognitive interaction, which is there opportunity for students to have discourse with the teacher, to have discourse with one another, and then to self-reflect on what they're learning. So let me show you an example of a tool that does this really well, I think. So this tool here is a tool called Fluid Math. And Fluid Math is a really interesting tool because it's one that doesn't require the use of a keyboard or a mouse. As a matter of fact, the best way to use this tool is with a stylus or a pen. So let me show you what this tool is all about. So here we have a Fluid Math, and you can see here I have some paper, and I want you to think of this as dynamic paper, right? Paper that allows us to do different types of things. So for example, I can do something like 1 plus 2, and it works on the concept of gestures. So there's 4 types of gestures. The first is simply an arrow. When I draw an arrow, you notice that it gives me a solution. Now I can change this. Here's a second type of gesture where I just scribble things out, and I can change this to a 3, I can change this to a 4, so on and so forth. But what if I didn't want any of that? What if I just wanted to say A plus B? What does that equal? And if I said I want A to equal 1, and I want B to equal 1, and I can change this. I can say I want A to equal 2, or I can say B, I want this to be 3. Or better yet, I can draw another gesture, a little line just like this, and I have sliders that I can move back and forth. And as I move back and forth, these values change. Now the cool thing about this is that I can add other things to this. I can say I want to know what A minus B is. I want to know what A times B is. I want to know what A divided by B is. I may want to know what the square root of A is. And so all of a sudden now, as these values change, these other values are changing, right? And so the learning now becomes dynamic. As I do something, I get immediate feedback and something else is happening, right? I can do this with other things as well. If I clear this page, do you guys remember how to plot lines? Remember that? Something like this, where you have a function like y equals 3x plus 6. Here's another gesture. It's called a loop gesture, where I just draw a little loop, and it creates a graph one. And so this graph here is fully interactive. I can move this around. I can say, I want this to be 7. I want this to be 8. Or better yet, what if I erase all that and I say y equals ax plus b, where a, I want that to be 1, I want b to be 1, and now all of a sudden I'm going to do those little sliders again. Let me change that out. And those sliders are going to allow me to move this line, right? So here we go. I'm going to draw that in there. I'm going to say a is equal to 1, draw my slider. Now as I move these around, my graph moves. Now, this is an example of, this concept of interactivity, right? Where the student is not simply just clicking on things and things are happening. The student is actually interacting with these things and different things are happening. So that's one example of interaction. So let me share with you the third big idea. The third big idea is that we want technology to be meaningful and purposeful. So what does that mean? Well, let me show you an example of that. Here we have an app that's available to all of you, and this app is called Chekov. Right over here, Chekov. So if you're a teacher that teaches writing or literature, specifically to elementary kids, this is a really cool app. What it allows you to do, it allows students to create their own stories. So if I click on this, you can create new stories. I have one here that I'm writing about paper, rock, scissors. And you can see here it's a real easy interface. So on the left, I have some pages. I can add pages. Then I have on the top some templates, and then I can add images, and then I can write some text. Now the cool thing about this is that I can also record my voice, so I can read to you. And so this particular app is being used by kids all over the world who are learning different languages. So kids that are learning English, kids that are learning Spanish, etc., etc. Now the cool part about this is that kids are not writing this for the teacher. They're actually writing or creating the book for an authentic audience of their kids. So what ends up happening is when your story is complete and you're ready to publish this, you can do this by publishing it to the App Store, and other kids can download your books. So let me show you an example of one that I downloaded from a particular student. It's called The Meaning of Names, and this is it. And so when I click on this,
Hello, my name is Lerato. Lerato means love.
and so you can see here that little by little, this particular student's learning English. And so he's doing that by telling
This is
me,
my friend Vanessa. Her name means flower.
and so what I did is I just simply downloaded this from the App Store. So we have hundreds and hundreds of these books that are available for you to download. So this is another example of a tool that answers that question. Is that tool meaningful and purposeful for learning? So that's the third big idea. And then the last big idea is this one, that technology should always serve the purpose of what we call a mind tool. And a mind tool is nothing more than having the learner learn with that technology as opposed to from that technology, right? So that the technology and the learner work as intellectual partners with one another. So let me show you an example of how a technology or a tool can be used as a mind tool. So here I have another example of a tool. This is called Edcuator. If you haven't used or heard of Edcuator before, highly recommend it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull the menu into space, and this is a simulation program. So I'm going to draw something for you, and we're going to see what happens. So right over here I have some tools. I'm going to click on this tool here, which is my brush tool. I'm going to make that a little smaller. And using my brush tool, I'm going to draw a bucket, okay, or a container. And inside my container, I'm going to take my rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle just like this. And I'm going to right-click on this rectangle because I have options. And you'll notice that one of the options is to liquefy. So I'm going to go ahead and click liquefy. And now it turns it into water. So I'm going to go ahead and play this to make sure all my constructions are good to go. Okay. So now I have some water inside my bucket. So now I'm going to go ahead and pause because I want to draw some other things. I'm going to click on this circle tool here. I'm going to draw a circle just like this. I'm going to right-click on this circle again because I have those options, because I noticed that one of my options is to clone. So I'm going to go ahead and click on clone, and I have two. Now on the right-hand side, I have other options, one of which is to attach different materials to those objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this one here wood, and I'm going to make this one here glass. And I'm going to close this out. And so my question to my class and to you might be this. Just by a show of hands, how many of you think the wood is going to float? How many of you think the one made out of glass is going to float? Okay, so let's try. I'm going to go ahead and click on play and see what happens. And as you can see here, the wood one did float, and the one made out of glass sank. Now, here's some interesting research. There's been a lot of work that's been done on the effects of technology in students, right? And the biggest thing that's come out of this is this. That whenever you introduce technology to students, whether it's a computer, a device, or a tool, right, you have to give them time to play. You have to give them time to play, because what happens is this. In their quest to figure things out, they're going to notice and learn how to work the technology. So you notice that as I was modeling this for you real quickly, when I clicked on this, not only did I have materials, but I had all these other things that I could move. And so students are very attuned to this. So what they're going to start to do is they're going to start to mess around with these. And at this point, it doesn't much matter what those words mean. What matters is that I can interact with them. So notice here that I have the ice one selected. I'm going to see if I move this around, if things happen. So as I move it to the right, nothing happens. But as I move it to the left, I notice that something happens. It begins to float. Why does that happen? Or if I click on this wood one, I wonder if the opposite happens. I know that it's floating, and it's floating even more now. But if I move it to the right, it begins to sink. Why does that happen? And so all of a sudden now, the tool has become a curiosity amplifier, something that makes students curious about their learning, and that's the goal. So this is an example of what we term as a mind tool. So when you think about technology, think about this concept of, is that tool serving the purpose of what we call a mind tool, where the learner is working with that technology as opposed to from it. So I'd like to kind of end our time with a video of some work that we're currently doing in Africa that I think is really compelling. So Africa suffers from connectivity issues. They don't have connectivity in most places in Africa. But every kid has a cell phone, right? And so the idea was, how do we take advantage of the cell phone? And so we come back around to this idea of FOMO, right? In thinking that, you know, these kids are always on their phone. Why is that? They need to interact with one another. Sometimes the FOMO is a good thing. And let me show you an example of what I mean in some of the work in which we're using this technology to help students.
The great Albert Einstein once said that in mathematics, it's not about understanding, but it's about getting used to things. So you get a lot of chance to study while on the go.
It has been a referral, a textbook, and extra tools. They will even go to a topic that I did not even do. They will go there and record it. And you will see that they know their content.
There is a whole attitude change towards the subject, whereas typically learners would be afraid for mathematics. They are now venturing into mathematics.
When you see a mark that you got in mobile maths, like you got 80%, and then I get frustrated and I want to improve it. So I'll stay on mobile maths maybe for like an hour, just repeating it over and over again until I get it right.
It does not go on site, it does not go on holiday, it's always there, so you can do anything you want to do.
It's a very good resource, which I would encourage schools to actually make use of this valuable resource that is available to learners.
I just want to be places and just do stuff that, I mean, my parents never got a chance to do research. That's why I'm actually pushing myself into mobile maths at the moment.
It's quite divine, absolutely amazing, fascinating. I have maths. I can do maths everywhere.
So this is just one of the many tools that are now offered to you that you have access to. So if you're math or involved in math, this is a free tool for you that you have available to you. There's many, many others. So as you folks are embarking on your journey using the Microsoft platform, the Windows platform, I highly encourage you to investigate and look at all these wonderful tools that you have available to you as you begin to learn how to infuse all of these different technologies into your teaching and learning. So thank you so much for your time, my friends, and have a wonderful